great.
I think the punctuation is okay.
Okay.
Tonight is the denouement, and I'm excited about that. But more than that, to get to know you and to be a friend of yours is a great gift. And I know I'm expressing this for the parish. So I hope you'll come back a year from now and talk about the revelation to John.
Oh my God. All right. As long as we're doing this. This is the week of the Judas goat.
Uh-oh.
But there is also a leader, capital L, goat, which is a particular kind of goat. Not just one of the pack, a particular strain of the goat that is found in Norway. And it is distinct because it has the remarkable intuitive sense to know how to lead his flock wisely out of trouble. That's pretty much the sense that I've come to have of you, that you have done a remarkable job in navigating this flock through many, many difficult times. And so this bell,
Yeah.
which you could wear around your neck,
I know, I was thinking.
beats the hell out of you crying out, it's time for dinner. So I present this with gratitude
Oh,
to
thank
the parish and to you.
So it's just like the scapegoat,
That's
too.
right. Yes, that too.
David, you're on.
Thank you. Well, my heavens, we managed. Now hold it, I gotta get the last part of this one. I was doing a practice run, yeah, and there you go, okay. And he walked in and I said, George, where's the damn caramel popcorn? I drove an hour and a half for the popcorn, and what you had is skinny pop. That pleased the people who have said every week there has been no sound coming out of these things. It also caused George to say, well, I'm not in charge of that. This was one of his lapses from being leader goat and saying, we'll get that caramel popcorn. Okay, the other great piece of news is we got this thing fixed. And I want to express, where'd you go? Oh heavens. Are you hiding in a back room? Anyway.
Terry's in the booth.
Oh, good gravy. Terry, you need to come out and take a bow because you figured out how to do this.
Yes.
And you know, lesser souls and sort of duller angels couldn't figure it out. So I was sitting up here, as you know, having what was supposed to be on my screen up there. It was very embarrassing because I had to turn around and I couldn't keep up with what I was doing. She didn't hear me, or she isn't going to come out, but we owe her great thanks. Okay. So I've entitled this set of remarks, Sorrow, Fright, and Awe. And I want to bring all that we've been talking about by way of the kind of attunement of our awareness. Interpretation is that progressively we become more and more aware of the complexity of the reality in which we already stand, namely in God's presence. And we'd spend an awful lot of time, lay people and clergy alike, bemoaning our supposed alienation from God. And I said, that's our fear. And the wonderful thing about the vigil is that it encourages us to recognize that we've been delivered from that fear. God is in the midst of all things. I love that passage. It's with his love. That's my favorite single line, Zephaniah 3:17. I said, I know, I found that this morning. It was a typographical error. I just looked over it where it was supposed to be in. He thought he was so proud of himself for correcting me. And I said, well, that's what bishops do on a good day. Important point with this whole business is that join with you and say, of course there's light. You know, a lack of the ability to have a party. But we get confused. That's great for our fellowship, but that's not to be understood as the delight in God. And that's really what I'm trying to say. So I'm really grateful for being chided about that. Sourpuss. That's what he said. Anyway. So I began with sorrow, much to your regret. And I conclude with sorrow. Sorrow is stillness in motion. Its lyric resonance is the sound of grace. The accounts of the great vigil have drawn our thought irresistibly toward listening to this lyric presence between the ordering of words. That means, it's a big phrase, isn't it? The ordering of words. We get so lost in our words. And then we start taking these words seriously, and we don't listen to the timbre, to the resonance, to the attunement, the ring. That's what's wonderful about chanting. Sometimes it's more important just to hear the tonality of chanting than it is to know what the words are. You know, these big. Supposed to do those things, to do the honorific thank you here. And he said, David, I know who you are. He said, oh, I would know those eyes anywhere. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand. He said, you fed me every morning for a year when I was in exile and in hiding. It's tonality. Tonality. We had never spoken a word to each other, but there was something in the air that was just magnificent. So, we've been listening to the lyric presence, or trying to discern it in the midst of the ordering of words. And we welcome narratives and prophets, and over the past 6 or 7 weeks that we've allowed them to cross our lives, bringing solemnity, wonder, and anguish. And all of them have come promising sorrow. And they have hoped to open our cautious lives. Through that somber sorrow, we have strained to see the intimations of connectivity that appear as hints of light. Usher them in. The Paschal Vigil begins here we have Yahweh separating light from darkness. So we read the story of creation and of the flood and of the sacrifice of Isaac and of the Exodus. So all along we've been learning about deliverance. But the deliverance isn't from one place to another, it's from ourselves and our fear that if we just act right, we can kind of cozy up to God. And if we don't act right, God's going to turn his back on us. So there's an awful weight that falls on our shoulders to do things right. And the good news of the gospel is, friends, you're already in full communion with God. God is in the midst of you, quieting you with God's love. the Thursday tomorrow, Friday, and then the Sunday, the Triduum that we. Resurrection, which lots of people like to fix up and have as a resuscitation. And so this is Raphael's version. Another resurrection figure, the altar of transfiguration in St. Peter's Basilica. Yet another, Raphael was very taken with, I mean, he's the great Catholic painter. Rembrandt's the great Protestant painter. So here's a tapestry resurrection. Now I'll leave it to Rembrandt to take off in a different direction and to talk about this. Is really, the resurrection is about the storm in the Sea of Galilee. Isn't that wonderful? Let's think about it. It's not about the trumpets, the brass band, the timpani, all the choruses. We're not at all comfortable with that. When you're in good company, early on, a little group of people, we have a fancy name for them. We call them redactors. Okay. And the end. Well, that's, I mean, tomb's empty, Job didn't get anything back, jig is up, the boat goes down, the ark never landed, starts and he ends his final chapter with the women lamenting, with women in sorrow. So they're standing there in sorrow. And I said, well, let's go do the women's work. We'll dress the body. And they're a little bit anxious about what we're going to do about that big old stone. And they get there and the big old stone has been moved. That's not exactly good news. So they go in and apparently we, of course, swoop in with our handy-dandy Nicene Creed, which came just a few years after the Markan account. And we fix, we're all reenactors, you see. We fix the Markan account. And so, well, he's risen, that means and they all say this doesn't have to do with resuscitation, it has to do with the restoration. The restoration. Mark's more radical still. You know, Mark starts off with this lovely story of the Transfiguration. I showed you a slide in the midst of the chaos of not being able to see slides, but there was one that went flying by the poet Blake. It's the Transfiguration. It's very Blakean, kind of spooky. But there are all the figures. You've got Elijah, you've got Moses, and you've got Jesus. And they're all out on a mountain. And the point is of that God shows up in places that nobody in their right mind would ever go. Which is a pretty clear sign that God probably doesn't show up in church. It's a pretty good sign that God shows up in the places that we don't want to go to. Which is the point, again and again. God shows up in the places. Luther makes it, Luther carries on at great length about it. I get sort of exercised about Luther because I think he's wrong about a lot of things. But one thing he's very right about is, we go looking for the King of Glory, and we look for this wonderful cathedral, and there's a vaulted altar, and he says, why don't you look at the tree? Which was a way in which they talked. And a sign. Now, in Mark's time, and I think he really does this, he really likes the Transfiguration story. He sort of invents it, and everybody else follows him. But it's a very important theme for him because it goes along with a theme of his time. That great heroes are ordinary humans are transformed, translated into great heroes by not being in their tomb. The absence means something. The absence is the presence of something you can't imagine being. treat, a Samaritan, that's no good. All these religious practices hurt people. So he breaks the back of religious practices about how it's a lot of people who are not terribly happy. By the way, in case I didn't say it before, if I've not told you, I need to tell you now. Mark is so astonished with Jesus' message that he invents a brand new literary genre. And that genre is called gospel. You think of it, oh, that's the good news. No. It's a literary genre which works very hard at bending the ordinary meaning of words. So the first thing he does is what's called parataxis. He just strings story after story after story after story, and goes faster and faster with immediacy. And then he starts 140 verses with the word "and then." Suddenly, anybody who's read the Gospel of Mark is exhausted by the time they're through the whole Gospel. It's not that long, but you sit there panting, you're spent. Then, to make matters worse, he will not tell the story in order. He arranges things thematically. Because he's trying to make a point. He's not trying to tell you a history. The third thing he does, this is my favorite. He wraps one story around another story. So that they force a different understanding. I'll give you one example. It's my favorite. It's the one that gets me in trouble all the time. That tickles me. It's the only thing I do well is get in trouble. So if I can just, and George is back there saying, "Yep, that's right. Last time we said we'd never do this again, and here we are saying the same thing. We're not going to do this one again." So, Jesus is scolding the Pharisees and the scribes for being prejudiced. He is really ripping into them. They're not very happy about it. Story one. Story two. Jesus needs a break, so he steps outside for a cigarette and dips into a room, and he isn't more than 3 breaths into his cigarette, and somebody comes and bothers him. So, excuse me. He says, "Can't you see I'm having a cigarette?" Excuse me. My daughter needs healing. And he looks at her, and she's a Syrophoenician, which is like being somebody who stars in Deliverance, okay? It's not something that you talk about kindly. So he says, you're basically a dog. And she says, even the dogs get to eat the crumbs from under the table. And he freezes. And he says, "Woman," and this is the most important line, "for that saying, your daughter is healed." What is it about that saying? She pointed out to him that he was just as bad as the Pharisees and the scribes. he freezes because he's human too. He put his foot in it. Then he goes back and says the real meaning of healing is to love with all your heart those who don't look like you. Okay. That's a remarkable little piece of literary work. And it's my favorite literary device that Mark uses. It's called incalculation. Anyway, I didn't want to bore you, but I had to slide it in just to let you know there's a real word for it. So what that all does, because you can't quite ever figure out what Mark is up to, is it restores the mystery of God. You don't read the Gospel of Mark to get an answer. You read the Gospel of Mark to get clear about what the questions are. It's remarkable. So the question is, what is the meaning of the empty tomb? What is the meaning of absence, of loss? Well, it's the opposite of possession. It's the opposite of presence. It's to say that God is just exactly the opposite of what we keep trying to make God. We try to put God into a formula. It's called a creed or a doctrine. Those things at one time, before you run me out of this place with a stick, those things were at one time poetic, figurative expressions. They're very beautiful. I mean, if you've ever read the Nicene Creed slowly, it's impossible to figure out what it's talking about. We go through a breakneck speed. We've said it so many times. You know, it's our brand. You've heard of branding? No. So we wear that, and that's what sets us apart. That's perfectly fine. It means that we wear that mystery. It doesn't mean we wear those facts. It means we wear that mystery. And that this is a people who's constituted by that mystery. And that mystery is not in the middle of a remarkable chorus of exclamations about that extraordinary moment. It's taking the tomb, the grave, seriously. What happens when we take the tomb seriously? Well, it brings tears to our eyes. There's a poet by the name of Picardy, of whom you've never heard, but you know his poem because it is the last chorus of the Bach Saint Natal Passion. I was there last Thursday night when the new conductor, Natalie Schlutzmann, conducted the St. Matthew Passion. When she came to the end and went to that chorus, and then like that, and for a full minute there was not a sound. And then everybody leapt up and there was 15 minutes of standing ovation because they'd been so moved. And what were they moved by? The poem says, we sit down with tears. Rest, you exhausted limbs. And comfort. The place where our souls are quieted, where they find rest, and where the greatest content, there our eyes will close in sleep. I have a friend who sings in the chorus. Bless his heart, he's 83. He's the oldest member of the chorus. He's been in the chorus for 33 years. I wrote him, and he wrote back, says, the biggest ambition for my life was to be able to sing that just once. And it's extremely difficult. It's a very demanding piece. It's got 2 orchestras, and 2 choruses, and children's chorus, 2 continuos. It's very, very complex. And he said, Natalie, that's what they call her. Natalie got us right off the bat when she said, if I were told that I was going to die in the next few days, there's only one piece of music I would want to have with me, and it is the St. Matthew Passion. I don't know if you know about Natalie Stutzman, but she is a world-famous opera star who has such incredible mastery that the Philadelphia Orchestra is trying to steal her away from Atlanta right now. She's just an extraordinary musician. My friends in the symphony tell me when she thinks they've not got it right, she stops them and she sings it to them until they get it right. Lyric. She didn't give them instructions. She just sang it. Hear, listen. See it with your ear. The empty tomb is about seeing with your ear. It's not about being reassured that what you see is going to fit something you understand. What you see is the intimations of connectivity that are only visible in the midst of sorrow. You know it. You know when you've been separated. You know when you're sad. You know when you long for those who you miss, and you recall what it was to be together. You recall what it was to be a family when you were growing up. You recall what it was to be with your children. You recall what it was to be with your partner when you were first lovers. You recall moments that slip through our fingers. And we live in the memory of that connectivity. And there's always a little bit of lament that we lie. Go home with me, lest the chance to come. Well, I've got news for you. I've gotten over to that place where the best is supposed to be, and I ache and I creak, and I have midnight wanderings down the hall. Good grief. Whatever happened to a civilized life? But there are these wonderful sensibilities. And we talk about them with our families and our friends. And in this community, we gather around those sensibilities, that sense of being in full connection. It's a Methodist way of talking, which gets all messed up. Full connection means that you're in good standing. And that's not what full connection meant. It didn't even mean that for Wesley, but Wesley was a good Episcopalian, so he knew better. It wasn't that you were in good standing, it was that you understood the rhythm of being in God's reigning activity. The emptiness of the tomb is the disclosure of the ruling activity of God, which we cannot comprehend. As soon as we make the leap to Easter, we miss the whole point. We fill the empty tomb with music, with shouting, with great symphonies, choruses, kings stand for them, and we all say, oh, that must mean something. And it means is he's getting tired of sitting. Handel's oratorio was awfully long, and you know, he needed his butt had gone to sleep. You know, he needed to get a little circulation, so he stood up. It was a very human way of talking about the fact that he just moved, and because he was the king, everybody said, well, this is so glorious. So we have blindly repeated for years singing Hallelujah chorus, thankfully, every Easter, you know, and we all get a big charge out of it. But it does something that is very painful. It tries to tell you what the empty tomb is. And that's painful because it robs the mystery and the glory of the reign of God. We don't know what that is. It moves us. It's grace. It begins and ends in sorrow. It begins and ends in resonances that are lyrical. It begins and ends in a sense of the incomprehensible majesty that we cannot say. And the wonderful thing about being human is that we can grasp all of those points. And the worst thing about being human is we get religious and we mess them up. You know? Well, I'm going to check your sermon out on Sunday, George, I'll tell you. Okay. So, I like this. This is done by an Oriental artist by the name of Key. He is not here. And this is the astonishment of the holy women at the sepulchre, 1890. This is the women in the tomb, and of course we've dressed up the dude in white who now becomes an angel. And we add to the story. We're redactors, you know, gotta fix it. This is the women at the sepulchre on what, this is by Ferdinand Boll, 1644. And what you're getting is a clearer and clearer sense of an earlier time when they were not afraid to talk about the mystery. Peter von Cornelius in 1850 did the Three Marys at the tomb. Once again, the focus is on the emptiness. Man in the Sepulchre is a pericope from Henry II. And Women at Jesus' Circular Box, Byzantine. And then see that all surrounding the empty tomb. So we preserve the mystery of the empty tomb. I like this one a lot. The Empty Tomb, Nestorov, 1889. Another empty tomb. And then women at the empty tomb. How we begin and we end. Lament, amazement, sacrifice and salvation. Zephaniah. There's Blake's Transfiguration. If we want to speak about resurrection, we might well be served by speaking of translation. All of us know that the figure of Jesus has been raised up in our minds as one who is of unbelievable epic proportions as a human being, so much so that we cannot comprehend it in the way that we cannot comprehend the divine. And that, my friends, is right. The truth of the resurrection is that the sorrow sounds with lyric gladness. gladness is unlike anything we know, and so it frightens us. And so we run away like Marys and say nothing to anyone because there are no words for the incomprehensible. It's frightening not to be able to say what is, but it's stunning to know that you've been in its presence. Thank you very much.